So I figured I'd shoot a little video here of some wheel bearing maintenance on one of the KTMs that I have. Um, we just finished 4 days of riding out in Utah and western Colorado, and I noticed on the 2013 250 XCW that I had a little bit of play in the rear wheel, and that's usually a sign that the wheel bearings are going bad. So popped it off and popped the wheel bearings out, and I've seen some videos online about lubing wheel bearings, popping the seals off of them and lubing them, and I thought I would give you a little bit of a tutorial on what I've found. So what I've got here on the desk is the wheel bearing collars that came off of the bike, the 250. And if you look at them, you can see that this area in here, which runs on the seal, is pretty worn. I mean, that's really worn beyond reuse. So those should be replaced. If you look here, here's a set of Pivot Works collars that I had from another bike. I had a spare set sitting around, and you can see where the seal's going to rub is nice. I mean, there's no evidence of any real wear in that area. So I'll probably use those when I replace it. These, I think, are going to go in the garbage. These are the stock ones. They're the same height, you can see, and the collars and sizes and everything, they're the same. So anyway, one of the things that the Pivot Works ones do is they put an O-ring on the inside here that's used for the axle when it fits in there, and the intent there is to try to keep water from getting in through the axle area. I don't really know that that helps much, but it's a nice touch. Okay, for those of you that like to do your own maintenance and maybe want to buy seals that instead of buying some, you maybe go to a local shop, like here in town we got Whistler Bearing, and they say sell seals and bearings. Anyway, the seal is a 3247 by 7. Okay, so that means 32 on the inside, 47 on the outside, and 7 on the thickness if you're going to get seals. And whether you get rubber ones or the steel ones, I've got some steel ones inside in the garage, it doesn't really matter. Either one will work as long as they're the right size. Okay, so I took the bearings apart, and this is the good bearing from the non-drive side, and it spins without any kind of roughness at all to it, and it's a Tusk bearing. The last time I bought these, I guess I bought Tusk. Anyway, the part number on that is 6005-2RS. So again, if you go into your local bearing shop and you want to get SKF bearings or any other brand, just ask for a 6005-2RS. And I popped the seals off of this one. So this came out of the bike. I didn't do any greasing in that. And you can see there's a reasonable amount of grease in there inside the Tusk bearing. So I would say that from the factory, you probably don't need to pop those seals off and re-grease it unless you just want to on your own. They look like they have ample grease in them from the factory, from the manufacturer. And to pop these seals off, you just take a small flat blade screwdriver like I've got here, a jeweler's screwdriver, and you just pry them up. You don't want to get too aggressive with it. They're rubber and you can damage them, but just pry them off, and you can see they come off without any real evidence of damage, and you can just pop them back on when you're done re-greasing them. Okay, so the Tusk bearing that was on the drive side where the sprocket was, that's the one that's got the problem in it, and unfortunately you can't really hear this, but just spinning it, I took all the grease out, washed it out, and it's definitely shot. I mean, it's rough. It's going in the garbage. And there's play. If you take this collar right here and you hold it independent of this outside ring, you can get lateral movement, which is what causes your wheel to move when you have it on the bike. Okay, so this is worn out. This one's shot. It had the same amount of grease in that you see in this one. So I don't think the reason it died was because of the grease. I think these just die. Anyway, now this is a PivotWorks bearing that I had from another bike that it's the same size. It's a 6005 2RS. And it comes from PivotWorks. And I've already cleaned the grease out of it, but I will say this: when I took the seals off and looked at it, the grease that was in this one was not as much as what was in the Tusk bearing. So I would say that the PivotWorks, although it had grease in it, probably didn't have as much that most people would prefer. So maybe popping the seals off those and re-greasing them. Now this is a used bearing. This came out of another bike, and it's a little gritty, but I'm not getting any lateral play between the center and the outer bearing races. So I may just pack this one with grease and keep it as a spare. But I'm gonna go get new bearing and put in there on the bike. I don't think I'm gonna put this one back in. Doesn't make sense. Bearings aren't that expensive. So that's some of my commentary on these things. For sure, these collars are worn and they're going to go in the garbage. The seals, I can reuse those, and I've got another set that are steel ones that I could reuse if I wanted to. And I'm going to use these PivotWorks collars. So I think what I'm going to do is probably make a run over to Whistler Bearing and just buy one bearing. Since this one feels fine, I'm just going to pack some grease in there. I'm going to clean it out, put fresh grease in there, because I don't see any reason to buy a whole set for this thing. Just buy one bearing and put the thing back together. It should be fine. All for now. So I went out and picked up a set of bearings from a local bearing supply house. They're Nachi brand, which they're a pretty good brand. They're made in Brazil, and I've used them before. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and pull the seals off just to look and see how much grease is inside of them, and then I'll video that for you. All right, so there's a blue grease in there, and I mean, it's not packed full, but there's an adequate amount of grease in there. I'll go ahead and put some of this Bel-Ray waterproof grease in there just to pack it full. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that you'd need to do anything with these, but I'll pack it full of grease anyway. So this is the second bearing, and this one doesn't look like it has a lot of grease in it. I mean, there's grease in there, but not a heck of a lot. So I'm going to pack it full of Bel-Ray waterproof grease, put it back together. All right, as you can see, I've got it packed full now with the Bel-Ray grease, and I'll go ahead and put the seals back on, and I'll put them in the freezer and then put them in the wheel probably tomorrow. So I made this tool to drive in the wheel bearings with. I put the wheel bearings in the freezer, and that usually shrinks them enough to where they go in pretty easy, but I took one of the old bearings and I cut a slot in it, squeezed it together, and then welded it. And then I had this long bolt that was, I think, a head bolt for the GTO or something. I got a bunch of them that I kept around. Anyway, I welded it in there. So now that's the perfect size, because I didn't have a socket big enough to drive wheel bearings in, which is what I've always used in the past. But this fits the wheel bearing perfectly. It goes into the wheel without interference, and I'll be able to use that to, you know, evenly drive in a wheel bearing. Just something that I played around with to make this afternoon. Figured that old wheel bearing, it wasn't worth keeping for anything anyway, so figured I'd go ahead and make a tool out of it. So there we have it. I'll use that when I put the bearings in.